Um, I have a Zoom call with Liz Nicolas, a Rochester attorney who runs her own company called Amethyst LLC. And she provides consulting, training, coaching services with the goal of helping institutions as they work toward diversity and equity. Race equity and anti-racism training are core parts of this work. So we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But I first wanted to talk to you, Liz, about how I first met you. And it was just a really delightful experience. You came to Spiritus for a talk, and I believe that Mike Boucher set that up, right?
Yep, that's right.
And it was about systemic racism. And I feel like that's a term that has become more a part of our lexicon in the, since that talk, which was in 2016. You had worked in the corporate world. You were then working in the nonprofit world, advocating for workers. But after your talk, I interviewed you, and I remember that, we had a conversation about white privilege. And I think in my own mind, I embraced the term. I thought a lot about the term, but I thought it applied to everyone else but me.
Sure.
I really didn't. I don't think I understood it until you were really just talking about a situation. Really, it was about the returning veterans, the GIs, and the different treatment that white GIs had, and the Black GIs, the veterans. And then I did some research, and I was like, oh my gosh. And it struck a chord with me personally because my dad was a returning vet who bought a home in West Irondequoit. So I wrote about that in my July 10th blog entry for Spiritus because it really was a sort of transformational moment. So it was, I appreciate that so much because it was, I think on your part, it was just very conversational. It was just part of what you knew. And but for me, it set something off. It was like, I've got to know more about this,
Right.
So,
I think it's a really key piece of anti-racism and racial equity work. When I do trainings or have conversations with individuals or organizations, a key piece of having an anti-racism lens is doing historical exploration. You have to understand the history in order to figure out what an explanation for present problems and thinking about future solutions. Because if you don't, you're going to come up with policies that are often unhelpful, they miss the mark. And so, our conversation about one of the biggest welfare programs the United States ever was involved in, the 1944 GI Bill. The United States really underwriting the building of wealth for so many people in the United States. I think, we talked about this before, so many of when I was in corporate law, the partners that I worked with at my company who were making, six figures, they were living in Philadelphia on the main line, they had a lot of wealth. They were able to build that wealth because of the GI Bill. And they talked about it. They came back from World War II and they said that they were able to get a college education and able to go to law school because of the GI Bill. Then they were able to get a home and they could pass it on to their kids and their grandkids. And all the partners that I work with almost entirely were white. And so I remember that being the snapshot, this understanding of, it's an example of what systemic racism can look like, that you had this policy from years ago that was institutionalized, that allowed for preferential treatment and this overdistribution to white Americans, and Black Americans did not receive the loans, they didn't receive the educations that they were supposed to receive in the GI Bill, but because of systemic racism, they were blocked out. And so that policy and the way it got laid out affected generations. It's still to this day, people are the home that they had, the equity that their parents were able to build, they were able to inherit. So it's just this snapshot. So when people look at still to this day, home ownership in Rochester for Black Rochesterians is still incredibly disproportionate compared to their white counterparts. And there are reasons for that. Like I mean, very quickly, Mary, we could talk about this for hours, but I had just looked at, a study from 1958. So 60 years ago, that was a study of New York, 5 major New York cities, including Rochester. And Rochester was listed as the city that had the most rigid barriers to home ownership, the sale of homes to Black Rochesterians.
Wow.
And so I was just like, so you see in our area what's come of that, but that's still the fact that those barriers existed in the 50s, continued in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So if you're looking to think through like, well, how do we fix that? You have to understand that history. Right. Your policies have to address the fact that those barriers are decades old.
So knowing that history, understanding that history then is really key. It's important.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so many people they don't have that history. They don't know it. Like for, I think we had talked about this briefly before, but in the United States, like if you were educating in the United States, like what you know about the history of racism and racial capitalism and white supremacy, chances are you didn't learn about that in school. You just didn't learn about it. So then how people view things today is affected by like what they learn and didn't learn as children and as young adults.
And don't you think too that our lenses, let's see if I can get more light here, that
sure.
our lenses are, they're colored by what we've experienced. So I wrote about this on July 10th, but in my mind, it was like, oh, there was a modest house. Somebody was always banging on the door of the bathroom because they wanted to get in. And
right.
My dad worked every weekend. But then when I think about the bigger picture, when I read, it was like, oh, wait a minute, this is a house that after my dad died, my mom had that equity. This was something that every single veteran should have given everyone.
Exactly.
No brainer, right? They went fought in a war and gave many of them, it's just, many of them lost their lives, and but many came back with the same injuries everybody else had, and here's what they got. And so the theoretical really was not a reality for them. So that did help me a lot to begin to understand that privilege can be a thing that's sort of arced over you, and if you don't look, you never really see it, So that was it was eye-opening, it was helpful. And I think if if we can all find that entering in point, those of us who are white and think, well, privilege, not me, like I was thinking, if we can find that entering in point and then do the history, that's helpful. So but tell us a little bit about where you've come from in your career and what you're doing now.
Sure. So as you mentioned, so I worked in corporate spaces, nonprofit spaces as an attorney, and I've worked on now both sides of the V. I represented corporations, and then I represented the workers who were facing corporate abuses. And that was like what I wanted to move towards. I love representing individuals in court. One of my favorite things was just being able to draft complaints on behalf of my clients who had discrimination, harassment cases, wage theft cases against their bosses. And what I loved about it was the fact that it was something that was like working towards using the system in a way that empowered my clients. Because I didn't have a single client that hadn't spoken to their bosses and their companies multiple times about the abuse that they were experiencing at work. But the only way it seemed to get their company's attention, I mean, we even had, defendants just say, sue me. And they were often shocked when they got sued. They're like, wait, we didn't think you're going to follow through. And so my clients finally were able to actually use the system in a way that could benefit them. The system that would often kind of like would be designed to squeeze them out. And so in my workers' rights advocacy, a theme that I could see was that even if I worked for client by client or even groups of clients, those companies were still perpetuating racist abuse. They were still excluding people according to their backgrounds in ways that were like deeply problematic. I was like, these companies, it's important to have actual policies within these companies and practices that are truly equitable and inclusive. Because, you know, again, one case at a time was making a difference for the clients, but it wasn't making an institutional change. So that's what I'm doing now. I started my company Black Amethyst this year, and I consult with companies around and do training and coaching around anti-racism work, race equity, and diversity, equity, inclusion.
Wow, excellent.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh man. So in a way, your work was a way to make a bigger difference, right? The way that you moved from corporate to nonprofit to this.
Yeah, I think, like, I guess the two things was I had always throughout my career, I would say the thing that probably is a thread throughout the work that I've done is my interest in systemic change, because I kept seeing, even when I was a teacher, I taught men who were coming out of prison and struggled with addiction, reading and language skills. When I was working with them, even though I was just like, I can work with one student at a time, it was really clear to me that the poverty that they were encountering, the violence that they were experiencing within their communities from the police and from just general, again, poverty and racism, those are systemic issues. And so I've always been interested in figuring out and really trying to figure out what are the systemic solutions to systemic problems. So that's been a big focus of mine. So I think two things. It's like I wanted to continue to help individual workers, but in a more systemic way, and with consulting and working with companies on a broader scale. But the other reason why I started to work for myself was directly connected to my own experience as a Black woman in the corporate and nonprofit space. I've never worked anywhere where I haven't experienced gendered racism, not a single place. And all of the people that I've worked with, my white colleagues have been really kind people. They were all liberal, progressive, and they were people that I was really close with. I spent time with their families. I had dinner at their houses. And it's within those work relationships that I experienced a great deal of gendered racism. And so one of the things that I started to see was really that even though I was working for race equity in my workspaces, even for myself, as a worker, I kept encountering the institution's refusal to shift or change their policies. And so because of my own experience, it became clear that I was like, I work really hard and I'm excellent at what I do, but I've never worked anywhere that has valued me more than I value myself. So then I was like, I should work for myself. I really should work for myself, because the idea of continuing to, invest and pour myself into institutions where I wasn't being fully valued in all of my identities wasn't a future I wanted to continue in. So it was working for myself has been part of my work, my own anti-racism work, and my movement towards my own Black liberation.
Yes, yes. Now you said gendered racism?
Yeah. It's a phrase that Ibram Kendi uses, but I don't believe he's the only one who wrote How to Be Anti-Racist. So what I experienced as a Black woman. So, Kimberly Crenshaw famously coined the phrase in, I think it was the early 90s, about intersectionality. So, there's the racism that a Black man might face and the sexism that a white woman might face. It is different than the racism and sexism that a Black woman will face. So having different experiences. So within the legal profession, like there is it's strongly structured within white supremacy, and more specifically, white heterosexual cis patriarchy. And
Yes.
I
Okay.
think that, yeah, it's been communicated to me explicitly, directly, multiple times about the ways in which it's like I didn't belong, I did not fit, I needed to be something different. And it was just like, I mean, Mary, I'm a Black woman. So I could never, the idea that I could somehow contort myself and be qualified, if I'm putting quotation marks, like be qualified if I were, or be more qualified or more worthy if I were a white man. It's just like, it's a delusion, it's a fallacy. But it's something that's really like, you know, I think the first day of law school folks asked, they said, now close your eyes, imagine an attorney. And then like they asked folks, they're like, who did you imagine? Most people are like, an old white man. And so like,
Right.
there's so many people who have this image of what an attorney is. There's a book I've just heard about that's entitled "You Don't Look Like a Lawyer," written by a Black woman. I wish I could remember her name, but I listened to an interview with her, and I just felt deeply seen and understood,
Oh,
because I got that I got that phrase a lot. You don't look like an attorney, and
wow.
something that was just really, I mean, demoralizing and
Yeah.
racist and sexist at the same time.
Wow.
Hence the phrase gendered racism.
Got it. Well, thank you for explaining that. That's
Sure, sure.
very helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, how about, so race equity and anti-racism training, what does that look like? What is it, you know, if a company or organization, a nonprofit, what things
Sure.
happen in your work?
Sure. So a few things. It depends on like what the company is interested in. Like for instance, how comprehensive they want to be. I tend towards, so when I'm contracting with a company, one of the things I'm really interested in knowing is whether or not, like what their current DEI efforts are, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, what their current work around anti-racism work is, and how open they are to continuing to grow and shift. I think there are companies that have asked to work with me that I've said, I don't think we're a good match, in part because from all that I could tell based on what they were sharing, they were not in the place where they were interested in actually shifting. It's kind of like they were kind of more interested in window dressing rather than actually like, I think we're really going to need to do some serious remodeling here, to extend the metaphor.
Oh, sure.
So, and because of a core philosophy of the work is that anti-racism work needs sustained focus. It's lifelong work. So within an institution, for what that can look like is that all of the staff needs to be trained. So even starting with the executive management team. So one of the things my colleagues and I focus on is being in contact and conversation with top management, because a lot of times, and I think this is happening more and more, Mary, you might know about this, like that there are companies that have done like, you know, a 3-hour unconscious bias training here, a 2-hour anti-racism training there, and they're like, nothing has changed.
Mm.
And the reason why nothing has changed is because, you know, white supremacy and all of that comes with it is deeply embedded within organizational cultures. It's within, you know, folks' policies and practices. So in order to actually really address that, you need something comprehensive. So engaging top management, making sure that they are on board and oriented around principles around anti-racism and race equity and diversity, equity, inclusion. An equity audit is another service that I think is really, really important. So getting a snapshot of where things are. There's some companies that have no idea about the race and ethnic makeup of the people who work there, but those things matter. So if a company is, for instance, like if I hear and learn that a company, their management is entirely white, that didn't happen by accident. That was because of years of decisions and policies that went unexamined, especially like, I mean, the United States, we have a diverse country, but especially within positions of leadership, there are less people of color, and there's an overrepresentation of white people and an underrepresentation of people of color. So walking with the company saying, here's a snapshot of what your company looks like, your demographics, and we do focus group meetings with folks. And then what can we do to change that? So what can we do to address that? And so again, if top management's just like, we're not quite interested in changing that, we just want the window dressing, we're fine with all white leadership, then we're not good partners. That's something we can, but if they are interested in shifting that because they know that what I've put out as a picture, that having an all white management within a diverse society is something that is a reflection of something, it's inequitable. And there are reasons for it that aren't about the story that you could pull from that is just like, it's only white people that are qualified. Not true. It's only white people that can manage people. Not true. But these are things that folks will also say, we just couldn't find qualified candidates of color. Okay. Also not true. And often they use the word qualified only when they're describing candidates of color. The assumption is that all white candidates are qualified, so they don't even say that. Yeah. So if you sit down with a company, you ask them questions like, what's your pipeline? Where are you getting your candidates from? Oh, referrals. So you're having folks only ask the people that they know. Often the people that they know share their race and ethnic background. So those are some of the things, like in terms of services that we work on. The actual anti-racism trainings will include every single anti-racism training that I do includes a focus on framework. So what we were just talking about, like making sure that people understand the historical context for race hierarchy within the United States and white supremacy. I think because there are a number of people for whom white supremacy is a very new concept. Like the idea that they might have heard of racism, they've heard of white supremacy, but they're thinking that just applies to the KKK. Right. That just applies to very bad people, bad racists. But no, white supremacy affects all of us and is within our systems. So that framework is really, that historical framework is really important. Lexicon, having a shared language around this, and then tools for addressing anti-racism work. So those are framework, lexicon, tools are big pieces of that. And one last thing that I'll say, I know I've been talking quite a bit because there's a lot that goes into this, but is something that is increasingly important to me as I do this work is race caucusing. And so within a given, workspace, it's generally workspaces that I'm working with. You will have, white colleagues and Black, Indigenous, people of color colleagues. And what I encourage and what my company encourages is for to have certain conversations within race caucuses. So having a white caucus and a Black, Indigenous, people of color caucus. And having those groups have conversations among themselves in ways that can be well facilitated, of course, but safer. Because what can happen is that for some of the white people, similar to what I was saying about kind of being new to the idea of white supremacy, being new to the idea that, wait a minute, could I be perpetuating racism? Yes, you could. And so if if folks are unaware of how they are perpetuating racism, chances are they can be very harmful as they're doing that. So the White Caucus is a space for white people to be reimagining a world without white supremacy, healing from white supremacy, and in conversation with each other. And then the Black, Indigenous, people of color space is a space to do the same, healing from white supremacy, imagining a space without white supremacy, but also not having to be concerned about white fragility, not having to manage white retaliation. If, for instance, a Black, Indigenous person of color shares something that's challenging, they're not then have to be tasked with making sure that the white people in the room are okay with what they just shared, which is a common interaction within multiracial spaces.
Wow. It's not easy work, but it sounds so just so important and so valuable. Like even just
Yeah.
when you started with and you said equity audit, like
Yeah.
that alone, it's like, oh my gosh, that alone is eye-opening. And then
Yeah.
moving into these other aspects, just taking the um taking certain associations away from some of these terms like white supremacy. You're right. Many
Right.
of us think of that as, oh yeah, those are the crazy people. They're the
Right.
that's
Right.
the
Right.
KKK, that's we're not associated with them. And as I listen to you, I think, well, there are many people, you know, that I know who are involved in social justice work, in volunteer work. They give so much. Sometimes they give everything to
Yeah.
good work, and they would never think of themselves as racist, right?
Sure. Yeah.
It's all good work. So, I guess that would be, you've kind of answered that, but if you want to elaborate on that more, like people doing good work and giving, maybe building upon, if you look at Spiritus, people building upon the Christian principles that they've either developed
Sure.
or grown up with.
Right.
It can boggle the mind a little bit, like, whoa, I'm part of this too. Like I'm one of
Yeah.
the bad guys. Like,
Right.
so.
Right.
Yeah.
I know. So one of the things that, I was just describing, you can do an equity audit for a company, for sure. But you can also do an equity audit of yourself, like of your own life, like looking at the spaces. Sometimes people, I've had white people respond really strongly and negatively to the idea of white caucuses, because they're like, I don't want to be separated out by race. That feels uncomfortable to me. I feel really singled out. We should be with the Black, Indigenous people of color because that's what progress looks like. Meanwhile, white people self-segregate all the time. And especially when I see, like, in this Rochester area in Western New York, I go to restaurants, sometimes I'm the only person of color in the room. And I don't see white people in an uproar about that. They're not like, wait a minute, what's going on here? In a city that's 40% plus people of color, why would there only be white people within some of these spaces? And so I think this idea of kind of like thinking through, the question I would have for folks is, if you're living in a world where, like, cradle to grave, most of your deeper interactions are with other white people and you are white, the people that you look to for leadership, mentorship, counsel, advice, support are also white, and you do not think that you have lost anything by that, then that's something to examine and to consider and to look at. But if you do, and you are interested in committing to anti-racism work, so the question I would have is, how are you currently benefiting from the racial hierarchy, from the current racial power structure? How do you benefit from it? And then what might you lose if you challenge it, if you question it? The reason why I would ask someone those questions is because if they do anti-racism work, they're always going to be grappling with those questions. Even the answer to the first question of, like, how I benefit is also directly connected to why some people never get involved in anti-racism work. It might be because they're like, I'm white, I'm a good person, I'm liberal, progressive, I recycle, I do good things in the world. So that seems like plenty, and I feel good about myself. And the people who are racist are bad people, and because I'm a good person, I could never, be part of that. And so there's a narrative that they are accepting and believing that is also part of a broader narrative around white supremacy that's been spun in the United States. But here's what's happening at the same time. There is continued, like, racist systems and policies and practices within our communities, within the Rochester community, against Black, Indigenous people of color. And it's brutal. It is absolutely, like, we can see with the recent protests around George Floyd's death and murder by police, this has been happening for centuries. So I would ask, you know, is it that you're choosing not to pay attention to this? Why would you think you weren't implicated in a system that is based on and crushing in so many ways and excluding Black, Indigenous people of color? How could you not be part of it? And I know folks have all kinds of answers to that, and people are in different places, but that would be part of what I would ask. Because again, anti-racism work invites critical analysis and self-reflection, but also most importantly, action. Something has to shift in what you're doing. So of course you can read the books, you can watch the documentaries, but what will you change about how you live and what you do, how you treat other people, how you vote, what policies that you'd say, not in my city, not in my town, we will not be on board with that because that's a racist policy, because of thinking about who benefits from this policy and who stands to lose from this policy. Doing, again, a historical, present racial analysis about that is really important.
Wow. So it really is, in order to enter in, we have to lose some of the traditional associations that we may have had with some of these terms, the
Sure.
language. So absorbing a lexicon that and approaching it almost academically instead of personally or emotionally, but looking at it, it sounds like that could be a good first step. Walking into that space and saying, no, wait, racist doesn't mean I'm a member of one of those crazy groups, but racist means I am who I am to some extent. I was born into some systems, but if I'm going to change the world, then I need to start by being aware and then be very active and purposeful, right?
Yeah, agreed.
Right?
Yeah, if you're going to change the world, if you're interested in changing the world, starting with yourself is a good place. And thinking through how you're participating and benefiting from white supremacy and and white privilege. I think it's something that I do know that I can speak to, for instance, just even the white people in my life who I'm close to, who I've seen work doing anti-racism work. There's a great deal of shame and guilt as they come to terms with being part of a system that benefits them. But it's kind of like, there is this general understanding. It's kind of like, at least, it's not true, but like being white in the United States is better than being. And so why, unpacking that, why would that be? Why is it better? And so at least looking at these most recent protests, just thinking about it's just like you can determine whether or not the likelihood that someone's going to survive a police encounter based on the color of their skin in a nation that's supposed to pay attention to the rule of law, cares about justice and liberty, that it's really what determines people's life possibilities is the color of their skin. That's absolutely absurd. It's primitive, and it's deeply unjust and racist. And so that is something I think it was really popular in the 80s and 90s for folks to say, oh, I'm colorblind. Right. I don't see color, which is, babies are seeing color when they're 3 months old. We see color. We see difference. I think what folks are saying is like, oh, I won't judge someone differently based on the color of their skin, but people do. And even if individually you don't, which I'm unlikely to believe you if you say that it's the case, the systems will. And so it's important. I think actually also a key part of this work is you have to talk about race if you're going to talk about racism. And there are a lot of people who aren't conversant or are refusing to speak about race. And it's just like, you're not going to address racism. You're not going to move towards race equity. You're not committed to anti-racism if you're actually not even speaking about race and racial hierarchies, which are real.
And so
although constructed.
If we don't even begin that, if we're not even open to discussing it honestly, then we're not going to get anywhere, are we? Yeah.
No. I mean, so, I highly recommend to folks Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy. I think that's a really helpful tool and she's very careful, or not careful, she's very clear about this, that it's not a book that you read, it's a book that you do. So going through the book, exercise by exercise, is something that I know has been helpful for folks. But also, I don't want to mispronounce his name, Resma, I want to say Menachem. I believe he wrote My Grandmother's Hands. He's a therapist and anti-racist a trainer based in Minneapolis. And his book also talks about the embodiment of anti-racism work, which is really important. Because again, it isn't, you aren't gonna think your way out of it. You aren't gonna just kind of like feel your way out of it, because racism is something that's been embodied. Internalized racism is something that's been embodied. But you can do your way out of racism. You can like actually practice something different than what you've been practicing. But if you're not going to do an honest assessment of the ways in which you've been like usually the idea, white supremacists, they're just the bad people who are bringing the crosses and are wearing the hoods.
Right.
What about the whole group of people who are complicit, who aren't doing anything, who are just not challenging the status quo? That's upholding the system of white supremacy and racism.
Right.
The way to address it is actually to challenge it, to attack it in all of its forms, and to work on policies and practices that are equitable for people of all races and ethnicities. But that's all going to take work. That's all going to take action. That's going to take lifelong commitment. Because, I mean, in my 38 years, I mean, all longer stories, but one of the things that I have been socialized into with respect to white supremacy is do not challenge it, go along with it, and it will go better for you. So, because if you challenge it, you might upset the white status quo, which will lead to danger for you as a Black woman, danger to your body, danger to my body, danger to my career, danger to my success. So my socialization has been, if I'm interacting with someone in a way in which they are communicating, I'm not as worthy of space or time or humanity, I'm supposed to take it. Wow. I'm supposed to go along with it because it's going to be safer than if I don't. Wow. So there's work for me to do around that. That's one of the things I'm continuing to work on and challenge. But that's my work. The work for a white woman in the United States, still going along the same path in terms of challenging white supremacy, is going to look different.
Yeah. And yet, as I listen to you, I think that just listening is so valuable. Just hearing the stories and understanding the feelings. And by living apart, so far apart. I mean, you look at Rochester, as you say, we really are. I know we've been called one of the most segregated cities in the U.S. And there are some interesting studies about what Rochester, is grappling with as far as racial inequity. The Hard Facts Report, the whole Rochester Anti-Poverty Initiative. There's so much data to go along with that. But on a personal level, it just seems to me that those walls and structures have kept us from really communicating and understanding people's stories. Like how valuable that is to hear, and how sad, to hear that someone like you is just going through, to hear that any human being is going through feeling less value than you are, or feeling that you don't belong in the same spaces that a white person belongs in, just right. That's just part of life.
Right. And it's not normal. It's absolutely, it's like I've been socialized to feel that way, and I don't. I think that the conflict I've continued to have was that within those spaces, I would fight for myself. I would challenge even though I was socialized to, I'm supposed to be quiet. Being an angry Black woman is the worst thing I could do within my profession. It's considered, and no one's paying attention to it. It's like, I would have every right to be angry based on the way I'm being treated and the way I'm being interacted with. So even though I've been socialized that way, I've, fought, and I have, because I'm like, there are these parts of me that I'm just like, I'm like, this isn't true. It's absolutely not true. This idea that I'm worth less, I should have less, I shouldn't ask for more because I'm a Black woman. It's just patently untrue. So I think that my voice it's gotten louder about that. And I think, that has definitely been part of my work. One of the things that I have felt really grateful for is remembering that in elementary school, we sang the Black national anthem every day. And it's something, it's especially since right now there's a lot of conversation around changing curriculums. Like, for instance, the fact that Juneteenth was now celebrated as, by the collective population rather than mostly Black communities. I mean, Juneteenth has been celebrated since 1866. So there were Black communities that had celebrated it, understood it as the holiday and declaration of like a freedom that it was supposed to be, that Black people had freed themselves, even over and against, white supremacy. Is something that's incredibly wonderful to celebrate, but folks didn't know about it. And I think that's part of the failure of the US education system, but also an example of how white supremacy looks within the education system. The parts of US history that are just completely taken out. The fact that folks do not know that the founding fathers were people who enslaved Black people. That's the fact that like folks don't know or aren't taught about how Native Americans were living in the United States. They were living in New York, and they were forced from their ancestral lands, and that was all part of continued violence against them. They were forced from their lands, and they were also killed by white Europeans and Americans. And so it's like the United States being built on racial capitalism and genocide. That's a really, really important part of our history, because that's part of it, because it's true, but it also determines how we look at our present. And so what I feel really grateful for is that I had educators who, when I was in elementary school in particular, who really cared about me as like a young Black girl. And I can remember celebrating Black heritage in school. And that was something, it wasn't like, the side thing that we did. It wasn't the thing that you only did in February in Black History Month. Every single day we sang the Black national anthem. Every day there was, or on a regular basis, the affirmation of me as a little Black girl. And so that just makes sense. Like the fact that, right now in schools, well, not with the pandemic, but that within curriculums, that there isn't an affirmation of little ones of all race and ethnic identities. That's just, it's wrong. Like the other thing I'm thinking of is just speaking to this ubiquity and intensity of white supremacy in this country. Mary, the phrase Black Lives Matter is a pretty modest phrase.
That's right.
It's modest. And it's revolutionary in the United States, because when I think of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza, Patricia Cullors, and Opal Tometi, like what they recognize is the fact that there's so much in US history and US present that points to Black lives not mattering.
Yes.
There's so much. It's like, all you have to do is pay attention and you can see that. But the fact that such a modest phrase, that being the floor, that Black Lives Matter, created, led to like such an incredible white backlash.
Right.
that should like be a window into how persistent, how deeply virulent, embedded white supremacy is within the United States. The fact that, you know, the response is, well, then we have to say all lives matter. Now, the statement isn't saying only Black lives matter. It's not.
Right.
It
Right.
centers Black lives because Black lives need to be centered, and because historically they have not been. So I think that
Yeah.
people are in an uproar over a phrase like Black Lives Matter.
Right. Yeah. One of my favorite signs that I saw at a protest was "Matter is the minimum," and I thought, you know, yeah, at some gut level, I was thinking the same thing. Like, matter means just what it says. Like,
Right.
but being precious, being, you know, there's so many other things that we could say that would say it in a different way. Like, why
Right.
would that set people off? You know?
Right. Right.
But
And I
I,
guess,
you know, I lived through the 60s and I felt like there were these little, I mean, I was a kid in those years, but I did sense little pushback things
yeah,
against the movement. And, well, you know, this is a little too radical and this is too, and I feel like we have to get it right this time, you know?
yeah. Agreed. We need to. It's urgent,
Yeah.
because it's literally costing people's lives. The white supremacy is killing people.
Yeah.
I think the speaking to just that that phrase being, you know, such a essential piece of the movement right now for justice. It's not just that people are in an uproar. There are people who, I think more specifically, again, to kind of circle back to like anti-racism work, being for good people and well-meaning, justice-oriented people. It's also about who can't get behind it. That's, I think, like that's, so there are people who are in an uproar about it, who are like, I have to say all lives matter. You know, I find this phrase offensive. I find the phrase racist, I've heard people say.
Right.
But again, the idea that there are people who can't support it does speak to, they can't support the floor for Black lives. Like that is white supremacy at work in the United States. And chances are they can't support that statement because there are so many places in their lives that they're not supporting that.
Right.
That just the idea of Black people in the United States being able to receive the floor, just mattering, is something that folks are like, I just can't get behind it. They might use phrases like, it's too political, it makes me uncomfortable. I questioning, why wouldn't you be able to be on board with a phrase that is so modest?
Yeah. What a beautiful question, Liz. Oh my gosh. And thought-provoking. Yeah. Well, I know we're running out of time, but
Sure. Yeah.
anything else that you'd want to add for those who want to take on this work? I would like to, you know, I'll jot down the title. I'll go back through the Zoom call and jot down the titles.
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're really being active and purposeful, and the work is daily, and it doesn't
It
end.
is. No, it doesn't. So the I guess one thing, there's, you know, many things I could say, but something, I do believe anti-racism work is for everyone across race and ethnic identity. But I do want to mention that anti-racism work is not a self-improvement program. So I think that that's one of the things I know I've picked up on. Folks are just like, I want to be a better person. I want to, anti-racism work is not a self-improvement program. It's anti-racism work. It is an ongoing commitment to justice. It is an ongoing commitment to equity for people across race and ethnic identity. It is an interruption of the delusion of white supremacy, the idea that white people deserve more, are entitled to more, and should rule over everyone else. It is a lie that I think that, to me, it's really, really important for people to examine, to interrupt, and to continue to challenge. And because we've, you know, we live in the United States. I mean, white supremacy isn't only here, but because it's part of what we're all swimming in, it's crucial for our collective liberation, for justice, and really for love, for us to continue to challenge something that's so dehumanizing and just false.
Wow.
So yeah, I think it is. I do know that there are folks who interact with it like this. Just it's about self-improvement, and I think that's far too small.
It's much bigger, right? Than that.
Right. Because also one of the things I would say also about that is like self-improvement is often something folks do, and it helps them feel good, and they feel better about themselves. You know, they're like, I've done this program and now I feel good about myself. I think if you are doing it right, or if you're really like in a place where you're challenging ideas that you've had, identities you've held, you might not feel good. You might not. Like you really, especially if you're like, I've been benefiting from the system, or I've learned how to game this system. I'm committed to that because I want to advance or succeed. If you are in a place where you're actually challenging it, there will be backlash. It will be hard, but it is worth it, because what's on the other side is a reimagining that I think so many of us are ready for.
Wow. Beautiful. Liz, thank you so much. It's
Sure.
been a pleasure to speak with you as it was last time. So
yes, yeah.
We appreciate your words so much and your wisdom.
Of course. Yeah. Mary, thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank
I'm
you.
looking forward to the day where we can be, closer together and
That's
can
right.